Now, on this day, 30 years ago, military President Ibrahim Babangida formally announced the annulment of the June 12, 1993 election. TVC News political correspondent Ayodele Ozubakun examines issues surrounding the annulment.
On Saturday, June 12, 1993, Nigerians trooped out to vote in the presidential election that would conclude the endless transition program of the General Ibrahim Babangida regime and confine the military to the barracks. The presidential poll was contested between the two political parties in the country at the time, the Social Democratic Party, SDP, and the National Republican Convention, NRC. The election is considered as the freest and fairest in Nigeria's political history. Chief Moshood Kashimawo Olawale Abiola, a wealthy businessman, was the candidate of the SDP who enjoyed massive support, cutting across ethnic and religious lines in the country. He was widely expected to win the election against his opponent Alhaji Bashir Uthman Tofa of the NRC. After conclusion of voting, Abiola was coasting home to victory after winning majority of states across the country, including Kano, the home state of his opponent Tofa. On Wednesday, June 23, 1993, before announcement of the final results, the then military ruler, General Babangida, declared the election null and void, citing alleged irregularities. But most analysts insist that the primary reason for the annulment was the fear of the political elite, including General Babangida himself, that the winner of the election, Abiola, would pose a threat to their power and interests. The annulment sparked widespread protests and civil unrest across Nigeria, as many people believed their votes had been disregarded. Many Nigerians and groups were also angry that the annulment was an attempt by the military to cling to power. General Babangida's decision to annul the election was influenced by several factors, including his desire to maintain control over the political landscape, concerns about the unity of the country, and pressure within the military establishment. Some Nigerians speculate that General Babangida was also influenced by external forces, including international pressure from Western governments. Annulment of the June 12, 1993 election led to a political crisis in the country and ultimately contributed to the downfall of the Babangida regime. On the 26th of August 1993, General Babangida famously stepped aside and handed over power to a hurriedly arranged interim national government headed by the late Chief Ernest Shunekon. The interim government itself did not last, as the late General Sani Abacha toppled it and became the head of state on the 17th of November 1993. The annulment also had long-lasting consequences for Nigeria's political development and democracy. After waiting for a year for the mandate freely given to him by Nigerians to be restored, MKO Abiola declared himself the legitimate president of the country at the famous Ekpetedo Declaration in Lagos on the anniversary of the election in 1994.
Chose me as their president.
The military junta of General Sani Abacha subsequently arrested and imprisoned him for alleged treason. It was not until 1999, 6 years after the annulment, that Nigeria transitioned to civilian rule, with the election of Olusegun Obasanjo as a democratically elected president on May 29.
Do solemnly swear.
Let's talk this through by talking to the Director of Center for International Advanced and Professional Studies, Anthony Kila, to discuss this issue. Thank you so much for joining us on TVC News this hour. Director, Professor Anthony Kila, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great, fantastic. Let's have this conversation. You know, a lot of people, especially the netizens, are having issues understanding the concept of June 12. Take us back to the scenario where the military head of state, Ibrahim Babangida, annulled what was adjudged the freest and fairest election. How was the news received?
Well, how do we define it? The history of the annulment of June 12 is a two-legged factor animal. You have the military intervention, you have the civilian intervention. Nigerians must remember that there was a group called Association of Data for Nigeria linked with to seek annulment before the election days. and went to court to seek destruction of the counting of votes. Civilian attempt. The main attempt came by the then head of state, General Bangida, that simply announced the annulment, saying that there were irregularities, and years later down the line, he stated that there was going to be a coup d'etat if he had not allowed the election. I think 30 years after the event, it's time to have a very calm look at it for historians to understand what really happened. As citizens, I think what we need to draw upon is to see that the events that came after that annulment is a return for the rebirth of the nation state Nigeria.
Well, 30 years after, a lot has really changed with technology and even more investment into the process. Have we learned lessons, or do you think we have actually learned enough lessons?
I think contrary to what people think, we have learned lessons, actually. I mean, 30 years later, so there's a whole generation of people who are probably 10 or 15 years, 30 years ago, and we do not do a lot of civic education. But I believe that generally speaking, people understand that no matter how bad, democracy is better than any form of dictatorship. I think there's an imbibed value. I'm happy you include technology, because thanks to technology, our people, young and old, can now compare themselves to the rest of the world. So the average Nigerian sees what's going on in other countries, and the idea of a military dictatorship is an abnormal phenomenon. It's good to remember that up till about 35 years ago, military dictatorship was not seen as so strange, because many countries had it and Nigeria was used to it. So there's a new generation in the world that just considers democracy as a given. Of course, it's abused, it's misunderstood, but, generally, there's a feeling that democracy has come to stay, and we've learned that we should defend our democratic principle. We can improve, but certainly we've learned it.
So let's talk about the man, Humphrey Nwosu, because this brings the argument again, strong individual versus strong institution. What do we need?
Okay, can you take that again?
Yes, I was asking about the man, Humphrey Nwosu. Of course, it brings the argument again, strong individual versus strong institution. What do you think we need?
Well, I mean, you need, see, the idea, it's a bit of a strange question that we have to ask ourselves. It is people who build institutions, but it is institutions that keep people alive. If you have a strong man, even if he's a saint, what if he gets to power and he goes mad? Or he goes rogue, or some people influence him, and you haven't got the sense? I think what you need in a structured order of more than one person that are not bounded by love or faith, but are bounded by secular constitutions, are institutions that limit everybody and does not allow others to oppress, does not allow a few to oppress the most. So to that extent, our duty to democracy is vigilance and institution building. And it is very important to know that in geography and history, across the world, in the countries we admire, and in history of the whole world, countries that do well, that progress and have prosperity and have peace, do so because they have strong institutions. It is not the benevolence or the evil of one man that will save us or guide us. It is institutions that will keep our dignity. Otherwise, only the lucky ones will be happy.
We're talking about, the legacies of June 12, one of the legacies which in terms of democratic participation and upholding the people's will. So how would you say the legacy of the June 12 annulment has actually, helped in terms of protecting democratic processes and upholding the will of the people?
Well,
because we've had several elections since then.
Yes, I'm a big author of the fact that the June 12 is actually good that came out of evil. Because if you look at the history of Nigeria, 1914, the amalgamation of Nigeria is not something we're really proud of. As a matter of fact, we don't celebrate it because it's something that was handed over to us by foreign powers. That's something that was made by foreign powers. 1960, we just created some false narrative. We don't really have freedom fighters because, the people didn't really die for Nigerian independence. So we've created some make-believe stories that are not really true. The first real battle, civic battle for nationhood is actually June 12th. It's what happens in 1993. So it is important to remember that battle that cost people lives, that delayed people's career, people were jailed, people lost their property, is actually the first reawakening of nationhood in the country. And it is important to remember that it's the kind of nationhood that was built out of the fact that religious, ethnic lines were blurred and people focused on what they thought was right, which is a democratic leaning, a democratic voice that was silenced and people fought to make their voice heard.
So, there has been compensation, at least to the one who was the figure, Kila, and then the former president of Nigeria, Muhammad Buhari, had, honored him, as president that never was. But then, are there any other ongoing efforts to, revisit the June 12 annulment and provide justice to those at least affected?
Those who read me know that I am an unrepentant critic of the Buhari administration. But it is important to note that, in all that darkness and blight, we must recognize that administration was the ones to appreciate the judgment. That was kind of a moment. The year Buhari called, actually called on the sources to say to us that they're going to recognize it, and then they sent a letter, which is a good thing. I think moving forward, I would recommend we continue to follow this and deliberate on the values of June 12, to elevate June 12 to the day of democracy, and so that people would know everything that happened around it, not to witch hunt anybody because it's getting too late for that now, but to know the truth and to be able to become warden of democratic institutions. I think that's important. It's not too much and it's not too late to name streets after June 12, to recognize the martyrs and the heroes, especially the unsung heroes and heroines of the June 12, I think it's a long list of names, but every sector had, and every community can bring forward those who stood for something good when some people try to push the country towards the outside. It should be a good thing for the people of Nigeria.
Right. Interesting thing. Something that we will keep talking about year in, year out. Director of Center for International Advanced and Professional Studies, Anthony Kila, thank you so much for your keenness of insight on this issue. Thank you.